Hello everyone, thank you for joining me and watching this video about how to create a creative composite photograph. And so here are my final images. On the left I've got a black and white image that I've pieced together from multiple captures, and on the right you'll see the hand. I've got a animated GIF that I've taken a number of additional captures to create this sort of movement. And I've also applied some color to it that I did all in Photoshop. So this lesson today is going to be a quick run through of how I've created this image. And before we start, I just wanted to give you a bit of a background on why this image and where I got this idea from. So I was inspired by the artist Dora Maar, and I will bring up her image, her photo montage that she created in 1939. So Dora Maar was an artist who probably is more so known as being Picasso's muse and lover, but she's also a photographer and part of the Surrealist movement. And so I came across this image a while ago and was really inspired to recreate this image because I think it's a really great example of how I can show how retouching, what you can achieve through retouching, and what kinds of imagery you can create that are possibly outside of this sort of realistic realm that photography is obviously associated with. And so let's get to it. So I've got my individual shots here, which I've got a sky, and I've got my main hand, and I've got a shadow for the hand, and I've got the shell on its own, both a lighter and darker exposure, and just if I ever need, I've got the sand on its own with nothing in it. And so when you are sort of shooting in this way, and with this I've got this sort of tabletop setup, I've got the camera in place, it doesn't move, and then I'm just sort of adding and removing elements and shooting specifically each part. So I'm going to go ahead and start off with my shell, and we're going to start there. So I'm going to just load these two in Photoshop, and we'll leave this the final image here as a sort of reference. And so I've just sort of combined them so that I can take these really bright areas and tone them down a little bit. So I'm going to do a really quick selection method here, and then add this darker exposure, sort of use my brush tool to also paint some of it in, maybe paint also some of it away. And I just want to make sure it's only really being applied to those areas that I want to darken and not the other parts of the sand. Okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead and just merge that down, and I'm going to start to label my layers because it's going to get pretty messy pretty soon. And I just want to go in and tidy up some of these bits here that are distracting. So just using the clone stamp and really kind of adjusting how I'm sort of brushing over them, and even adjusting the hardness as well of the brush, and really trying to vary how I'm kind of going over this so it matches the texture of the sand. Okay, great. So one thing, let's go back to the image of Dora Maar. So she's got her hand is sort of coming out of the shell, and I ended up finding all of these items here locally at a beach in Nova Scotia, and what I'm using in mine is a clamshell. and so it doesn't have as wide of an opening. So what I've done to kind of give me a bit of that room is I've taken a photograph of the back of the shell, which I'm going to just take this sort of piece to create a larger sort of opening. So I'm going to grab just the little part of this because I really only just need this top part of the shell. And let's name this back shell. Bring it on over. Let's close that because we don't need it anymore. And I'm just going to reduce my opacity so I can see as I sort of align it. So I really want to give it enough room so that the hand, so we can still see that the back of the shell even with the hand in place. Okay, so I'm going to try to give that a go. And what I'm going to do is just hide that and then mask it in. And so I'm going to be really careful now to make a really good selection edge along the front edge of this shell. And you could use sort of any kind of selection tool, but I'm just sort of doing these all by hand because I find this the easiest way, I guess, or I mean, depending, if I were trying to mask hair, I could not do it by hand. So you sort of have to adjust your method based on what it is that you are working with. And I'm likely going through making these masks just a little bit faster than I normally would, but normally this kind of process of compositing using multiple images requires a lot of fine-tuning. So you could make a mask, you could put everything in place, and then you could realize, okay, it still doesn't look right, and that mask edge needs a bit of attention. So it's a constant sort of process of working and chipping away at things until it all comes together. And I've obviously got all of my images sort of clearly outlined and labeled. Obviously, when you're shooting, the captures don't come out of the camera labeled in that way. So there's definitely, it's a bit of a messy process, and so I've sort of done this tutorial a couple times and sort of know the ins and outs of it so far. So, and I think I can just move the position slightly. Okay. I also want to darken that because it does have to look as if it's sitting behind and sort of in this shadow. Okay. And now I'm just going to go around and mask that top edge. And so the idea here is just you sort of take it one thing at a time. You add in one piece. Oh, we can see that behind there. That's okay because we will eventually have a sky that goes back there. So I'm just gonna, in the meantime, just put a solid color back there just so I can make this edge. But yeah, this is a sort of constant process of sort of doing one thing after the other, and eventually it will all come together. Composite images could take anywhere from an hour to a couple of hours, depending on how many pieces you've got, how much sort of fine-tuning there is. When I get to adding the shadow onto the hand, those little realistic elements, if not done right, will always kind of look off, and the sort of believability or I guess realism of the image will be thrown out the window. Although we all know that this isn't exactly a realistic image, but more of a surreal one. Okay, just going to kind of go through this a little bit faster. It's a lot of masking, so it's really good to have all the tools under your belt when it comes to masking. It's a good mask. Again, it's going to hide the sort of heavy sort of retouching that we're doing here to get this image created. Okay, that's the back of the shell. And maybe just a little bit darker. Okay, so there we've got our shell, the front part, the back part, and before I bring in the hand, I'm just going to make my life easier by taking the sort of front piece of the shell and placing it at the very top of my layers. That way when I put my hand layer in there, I'm going to put it just below that, and it's going to be really a lot easier for me to choose the right spot for it and location. All right, let's just show you. There's the front of it. Okay, so now let's grab the hand. That's the main hand. And again, I really only just need this section here with the shadow and the hand. So as you can see, because I've got my front of the shell there, it's going to make things a lot easier choosing a spot. And I'm just gonna turn my opacity down because I want to see the back of that shell, sort of where the hand sort of fits within that. Okay, so I think that's looking pretty good. And again, I'm going to now go through another process of masking this and removing everything but the hand and the shadow. So I could also do all these masks in the actual image before starting to compile it into one, but I find I like to have it in its place, and then that way I can look at making the right mask based on what's below it in the layers or what's above it. Here I'm just going to kind of really make my brushes jagged to kind of disguise it within the texture of the sand. Oh yes, and I do want to make sure I get in over here so that I can see the back of that shell. And I think this is my, yeah, there's my front shell layer that I really quickly masked. And I'm just tidying up my layer mask here and looking at the black and white view of it. So with the layer mask, what that does is it hides a part of the layer. So everything that's colored black will be completely hidden and everything white is completely revealed. And every shade of gray in between represents a different opacity. All right, and just this part at the top here. Okay, so I've got my hand in there, and actually let's just get in a little bit closer and sort of overlapping over the shadow of the shells. And while I'm here, I'm just going to go ahead and do a little bit of cleanup because I want to extend the shadow So I want to extend the shadow and sort of make it merge with this other one. Oops. Okay. All right. Looking pretty good so far. Now, one thing I just want to do while I'm here, okay, I want to start labeling these so things don't get messy. And just want to take down this highlight right here. It's a little bit hot from the light. And I'm just gonna also brighten up this part just a touch. Okay, I better save this. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to add is I'm going to create a little shadow that runs from sort of the top left here and kind of comes down along this way and just sort of gets softer the further away. And so I did try to actually shoot a shadow that I could use and sort of repurpose, even though I think it doesn't quite make sense to have a shadow with the lighting, but in order for this to really make a bit more sense, having that shadow really grounds it. So I just need this little piece here, so I'm going to grab that and let's start getting it in place. And actually, let's reduce the opacity here. Okay. And I'm going to change this blend mode, just kind of lighten it up a little bit, reduce the opacity there. And I'm actually gonna shape it with a mask. Just like kind of paint it away till it looks right. And so the shadow, it would make sense that the shadow that's right next to the shell, well, the hand is almost right next to the shell here, and I guess it kind of falls off the further it gets. So the shadow should really be a little bit more like a hard shadow and then fading off. So I guess I didn't exactly quite use the shadow as it was in the capture, but I'm always trying to, if I have a real shadow that I can use, it's a lot more realistic than actually recreating it in post. Well, why don't we also now, let's just get rid of the colors so we're not distracted by any of that. And so this is probably something that I might spend a good amount of time on, and it might be something that I come back to, you know, take a break, come back when I'm really feeling like I can chip away at this and I'm in the right mood for it. Sometimes there are some tasks that are a lot easier than others, and you just have to be sort of prepared for them. All right, let's get the sky in now. So I'm just going to convert this to a smart object because I'm likely going to kind of move this around and make it bigger and smaller. I don't quite know exactly. And so if I ever scale down a layer and then scale it up and then keep doing that, you will decrease the quality of it. So the smart object prevents that from happening. So I've kind of got it almost at the bottom of all of my other layers. And what I'll actually do is I'm gonna just create a sort of edge over here, a sort of fake edge using a brush that's a little bit more, it's got a little bit more of a texture to it, because I almost want it to be similar to the texture of the sand. So there's a ton of brushes that you can find online that are really great tools to have when you need something different. And I've just put a guide there so I can sort of know what the straight line is. But I do want it to be a little bit more even jaggedy. Okay. And let's continue on here. Just tidy up that edge a bit. Not too concerned about what's behind the hand, but I might come back to that eventually when I work on the other images of the hand. And now that we're here, you can already see the mask for my hand needs some additional love. Let's go back and choose the right brush for this job and the right opacity. And so, like I mentioned earlier, you'll always be sort of adjusting these mask edges depending on what's behind it, how light or dark it is, oops, and how visible those edges are. Okay, so now that I've got the mask done, I can kind of play around with if this is the right location for it. I do really want to bring out the sort of moodiness here of that sky. And so here are kind of all of the pieces in place. Likely need to get in and do a little bit more of an accurate cleanup of the masks. I can also get in and do a little bit of cleanup on, let's say, the hand. Things like extending this shadow. And there's just a tiny little gap here. It's a little distracting that I'm going to get rid of. So you're really just trying to remove any kind of distracting elements, any kind of dust or scratches. Anything to simplify, remove distracting things. You can sort of clean up a bit of the nails here and go even further with the skin if I really wanted to. And then I might start adding now some sort of overall adjustments to really bump up the contrast. I do really want to brighten up this corner edge of the sand. Go, it's a lot better. Just so with a brighter edge here, it will really stand out nicely against the darker sky. That said, I want to get a few darker bits into the sky as well. And so I can apply adjustments sort of overall to the entire image, and in other parts I'm going to selectively choose to add it in where I think it needs, let's say, a little bit more contrast, a little bit more darkness. Maybe I want this area to be a little bit brighter. It feels a little bit dull. Maybe I want to give just the sky another boost of contrast as well. Oh, that's a lot too much. So it's a bit of a push and pull until things kind of look right. And I do also want to give it a bit of a vignette, so there's some darker edges along the front here. Yes, and I do also need to make sure that is applied to my other hand layer. But just in the part of the sand. Okay. And now let's just compare to my previously completed image. So there's definitely some areas that I can see I did a little bit more work on, like brightening up this front shell and adding some more contrast to this shell. Let's go ahead and do that. And let's brighten up the hand a little bit. Okay, so there's a really quick version putting this together, but I would say I would probably be here for another little while, really fine-tuning things and taking a look at some of the more close-up details. Like, for example, it's a little bit too bright in there. So that's the back of the shell. So now, as you can see, I've got this huge layers panel full of all these layers. That's why it comes in handy to label everything. I'm just gonna darken that up a little bit, but not too much, because I don't want the edge of the hand to disappear. Okay, there's first part of creating this composite image.